purpose of this lesson is to learn what macros are and why we need them, how they apply to Excel, the different file formats and which ones support macros, how to use the macro recorder, how to configure Excel to run macros, and how to set macro security for network locations. Welcome to Visual Basic for Applications. My name is Brian Pringle, and I will be your instructor for this course. Excel is an excellent utility for performing calculations on large sets of data. The problem is that a lot of times we end up doing repetitive tasks. And these repetitive tasks, things like cutting and pasting fields, doing the sum, doing things like searching for blank fields and so forth, those all require user intervention. This takes a considerable amount of time, and the user could be spending that time doing something more important. Excel does not natively support automating more advanced tasks. So some of the minor tasks that we can use, we can use the wizards and automate things like doing conditional formatting and something like that, but there's no way to customize how the wizards actually perform their automation. That's where macros come in. A macro is a script that we run. It's recorded using a programming language, and in this case it's going to be Visual Basic. It is a limited version of Visual Basic, but it has large capabilities. And what the macro does is that we allow the macro to programmatically do things that we manually would have to do in the spreadsheet. So the macros are going to be embedded in the workbooks or shared with others, so we can save it inside of the workbook, we can save it somewhere else, and then we can actually pull that data into our workbooks and use the macros. Every computer that has Microsoft Office installed has the ability to run the macros. And there are estimates of somewhere between 500 to 750 million computers have Microsoft Office installed on them. So if we have that many computers out there that have Office, and then we have that many computers out there that we can use Visual Basic for applications, we can use our macros. There are different file formats that we can use. The old Excel 97 through 2003 workbook, the .xls, macros are supported in that format, and there was no differentiation. In the newer version of the Excel workbook, the .slxx, the macros are not supported. If we want to save a workbook and we want it to have macros, we have to use the Excel macro-enabled workbook, which is the .xlsm extension. We also have Excel binary workbooks. Now macros are not supported in the binary workbook. There are ways to make them run, but by default we should be using the .xlsm. We want to make sure that if we're going to be doing a large number of these workbooks where we're going to be using macros, that we want to enable Excel so that it will save these as the .xlsm format by default. One of the first things that we need to do is we need to turn on what's called the developer toolbar. Now there's a different way to do it on the Mac versus on a Windows computer, so I'll show you both. On the Mac, you want to go up to the Excel menu and select Preferences. At the bottom of the Preferences, in the Preferences panel, you'll go to View, and then at the bottom you'll see in ribbon Show Developer tab. You check this tab and that turns on the Developer tab. Now, if you're used to using Office on a Windows computer, you'll also want to check this Group Titles, because what that'll do is on the ribbon, underneath of the sections for things like your formatting and for inserting and things of that nature, it'll actually put the title at the bottom. On Windows, we open up the Excel workbook, and then what we do is go up to a blank area on the ribbon. You're going to right-click anywhere in a blank area, select the Customize the Ribbon menu item, and then from the Excel Options window, you want to select the Developer Toolbar. You put a check mark beside it and then click OK. So there is a difference between adding the toolbar on the Mac versus on a Windows computer. Alright, so right now I have a blank workbook open. You'll notice they do not have a tab up here called Developer. So to turn that on, I'm going to come over here to a blank area, right-click, Customize the Ribbon, and you'll see that the Developer Toolbar by default is unchecked. So all I need to do is check it, click OK, and now I have a new Developer tab. Now the new Developer tab will give me some things like Visual Basic, macros, I have the macro recorder, I have add-ins that I can use, I can insert things, I can view code, I can view the source, and so forth. So what that's going to do is that's going to enable us to be able to use these functions that we need to be able to perform programmatical functions in our Excel spreadsheets. So the question is, what does a macro look like? A macro looks just like anything that you've seen in Visual Basic before. Now what you'll notice is if you've used Visual Basic in the past, this looks like Visual Basic from the 90s. And the reason for it is, it actually is an extension of that old version of Visual Basic. So we have over here on the side, we have our project window, we have our properties down here on the side, and then we actually have our workspace over here. Now there are a couple of other things we can turn on, like an immediate window can be turned on at the bottom, but by default this is what a macro looks like. Now it starts off with a procedure name, and then what we do is we just simply type our code in standard Visual Basic code. Alright, so how do we get to that window? The way that you get to that window is in Windows, we go to the Developer tab and select the Visual Basic button, or on the keyboard we can press Alt F11. On a Mac, we'll have to go to the Developer tab and go to the Code group. Now the group name is not displayed unless you put that check mark in the Group Titles box when you turn on the Developer toolbar. Same thing, we can press Alt F11. However, on some of the Mac keyboards, you may have to do Function Option, which is your Alt key, F11, to be able to access it. We're going to start with using a thing called the macro recorder. The macro recorder allows you to just simply let the system record whatever you've done. It's the easiest way to get started with macros. I want to automate something, I know how to do it, and so therefore what I'm going to do is I'm going to perform it and let the system record me performing that. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to give it a name. So we type in whatever you want the macro to be called. We need to type in a shortcut key, and by default it'll be Control plus something, and then if you hold down other keys on the keyboard, like I did Shift M here, then this will do Control Shift M, and if you press that keyboard combination, it will actually perform your macro. The next thing is, where do you want to store it? You can store it in the workbook or somewhere else. And then we can give it a description, which is optional. And then when we're done, you go and click OK. Now, once you do this, then it's going to ask you to, not ask you, but then it's going to allow you to perform whatever task you were doing, and then it will just simply record whatever you were doing. All right, so I am in a blank workbook right now, and what I want to do is I want to get to the macro recorder, which is under the Developer toolbar. I'm going to go ahead and click on Record Macro. And it starts off by asking me for a name for the macro. So I'm going to call it My Macro, and no spaces or anything. It has to start with a letter. We need to type in a shortcut key. Now I want it to be Control Shift M for macro. And the question is, why don't I just do Control M? And the reason for it is all of our built-in Windows shortcut keys are always Control and then some sort of key on the keyboard. Well, I don't want to get this confused with a regular Windows built-in function. I want the user to realize that they're running a macro. So I'm going to do Control Shift M, and then now what that did is just it added Control Shift M here, and now the user has to specifically run this. Also, what it does is it prevents me from using the same keyboard combination that's already used for something else in Windows. Alright, store macro, and we can choose where we want to store it. If we want to store it in a personal macro workbook, in a new workbook, or this workbook. Alright, so I want to store it in this workbook. I'm going to give it a description. This is optional, so this is my macro. And go ahead and click OK. Alright, so now what it's doing is it is recording. You'll notice up here it says stop recording. It is going to keep recording whatever I do until I click this. Alright, so what I want to do is I'm going to type hello here. Press enter. I'm going to select over here somewhere. Type how are you. Press enter, and let's do something like we're going to take how are you, and we're going to make the font size larger. Maybe we make the font size or the font color, let's say blue, and we're going to make this cell larger. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and what it actually just did behind the scenes is it created a new macro. All right, I want to see that, so I'm going to go over here to Visual Basic. And then what you'll see is that I have a new module over here called Module 1. And so what I'm going to do is I want to view the code. And you'll see that in this code here, and you'll notice it's also called My Macro up here. This is the procedure name. But what it did is active cell dot and then formula R1C1 equals. So what it's doing is it's telling the system, hey, in cell, in the active cell, whichever one the active cell was, type in hello. And then go to the range of F9, which F9 is this cell, select it, and we typed in how are you. Sorry, the first one was select. Then when I clicked on it again, then I made it larger. Now every time I clicked on the font size and made it larger, it kept track of that every single time. All right, then I took the selection and we're going to shade it. So we changed the color to something. And then the last thing I did was to change the column width to 28.6, which should be about what it is here. Well, it wouldn't let me see the text in there. But what it did for me is it made it where all of this stuff is the things that I did. And now what I can do is I can rerun this whenever I want. All right, now the problem is let's say I really did want this to be font size 22. Well, every time I run this script, it's going to make the font size 12, then 14, then 16, then 18, then 20, then 22. Do I really want that to happen? No, I just want the last thing. All right, so what I can do is I can delete these and just keep the last one. So that way it just simply keeps the last one. All right, now the problem is the recorder does what I want it to do. It does record the stuff. It does save it for later. It does let me do things, but it creates a lot of extra stuff that we don't really need. And the other problem is that it only works on absolute value cells, which means that when I run this again, no matter what, how are you is going to exist at F9. The macro recorder can't differentiate that it's so many cells to the right and so many down from wherever I selected. So there are limitations to it, but the benefit to using the macro recorder is that I can see what it's doing, and if I get stuck on, I don't know how to get it to select a specific cell, I can run it and see, oh, hey, that's how we select that cell. How do I replace the text? Oh, that's how I add text to it, and so forth. And so the macro recorder is a good starting point, but it's not going to be the end of what we want to occur. All right, so I want to put this back. I'm going to delete this, delete this. I'm flat out going to delete this cell or this column. And then what that did for me is just kind of put everything back the way that it was. All right, so how do I use that macro? Well, the way that I'm going to use it is I'm going to come up here to the macros menu item, and you'll see that I have my macro here. And what I can do with my macro is I can run it. And now what it did is it just simply took and put hello and how are you back in there. All right, so I don't necessarily want that. Let's go ahead and put this back again. I wanted it to be in some other cell. So I'm going to select way over here, and then I'm going to run my macro. And what I'm hoping will happen is when I run it, I want it to put hello here, and I want it to put how are you somewhere down here. Well, watch what happens when I actually run it. The problem is the way that our code is set up, the active cell, whatever the active cell is where hello gets written. But then how are you will always be at F9 because it's an absolute cell reference. And like I said, the macro recorder by default will always do that. It will always select as a relative location. All right, so we do have limitations to it. And what we need to do is realize that the macro recorder is a good starting point, but not necessarily the end of what we need for our programs to run. Also, when I went up to the macros, you'll see that I have the option to run it, step into it, edit it. I can delete it, and I have other options. So if I edit it, that will take me to the actual macro editor. And then if I come up here and I do things like options, we can change what our shortcut is, and we can also change the description. So if we don't like that it's Control-Shift-M and we want to change that later, we can do that. We can always change it later. The only thing is we need to make sure that our macros, each one has to have a different key combination. Otherwise, the system will get confused if it will even let you create them. Now, the step into this will allow us to troubleshoot our code. We'll get more into this in a future lesson. You need to be aware of some security problems with macros. One of the big things is that macros have full access to the operating system, which means that they can be used for malicious intent. By default, macros are now disabled. That's been ever since Office 2003 when they realized that macros were a problem in the older versions. So they set it so that they're not automatically enabled. The user has to manually enable them now. Even after enabling macros, though, some of the network locations are not going to be trusted. So what we need to do is we need to tell the system which folders on the network are actually allowed. What this does for us is it allows us to set that we have a specific share on the network where we store all of our Excel workbooks that have macros, and then we can do things like set group policy that will allow us to tell all of the computers on the network that that particular folder is allowed. And what that will do is it allow us to disable the notification that there are macros and just simply allow them to run. Otherwise, the user has to click the Enable Content button each time they want to run a workbook. The Enable Content button on Windows looks a little bit different than it does on a Mac. On Windows, you get this little toolbar at the top, and it just simply says Enable Content. The user has to click this. It reloads the workbook, and it enables all of the macros. On a Mac, they have to click the Enable Macros button down here at the bottom, but you also have the option to not even open the workbook or to open it with the macros disabled. Now, the reason that you may want to open it with macros disabled is, let's say we have a workbook that we need to use, but we don't necessarily trust it. Then we can go ahead and open up the workbook without the macros enabled, make sure it's what we really need, run it, and then if we need the macros, then we can turn those on later. To enable these locations where you can trust the documents, we need to go up to the File menu. Remember, this is called the Backstage view. Then we're going to go down to Options. And then in Options, we're going to go to the Trust Center and Trust Center Settings. Now, the macro settings are listed here, and we have the option to disable all the macros without notification, which means the user flat out cannot run macros. We can disable all macros with notification. This is the one that will pop up, the Enable document. Disable all macros except digitally signed macros. So we actually can digitally sign these, and if we have one that's signed, then it can automatically open it. Or we can enable all macros, and this is not recommended at all because this will tell it that all of the documents, no matter where they came from, can open, they can run their macros, and everything is completely trusted. This is dangerous. Don't ever use this one unless you absolutely have to. If we are a developer for macros, then we want to trust access to the VBA project object model. But usually when we're developing these, we don't necessarily need this. So we're going to leave this turned off for now. The other thing we want to do is we want to do trusted locations. And if we have a location that we want to trust, so say we have a network share or something like that, we can add a new location. And then we can tell it also allow trusted locations on my network. Now what this will do is it'll make it where any network location that we have is trusted. We usually don't want to just blanket open it up. We usually want to specify exactly where is trusted and specify just one specific folder. The other option is to disable all trusted locations, which means the computer will never trust anything, not even on the local computer. The next thing is to save these documents. I'm going to go to File and then Save As. And then what I want to do is I want to save these things somewhere on this PC. So let's say to Documents. And then what I need to do is instead of saving as the type of Excel workbook, I want to change it to an Excel macro enabled workbook. And what this will do is it will enable the extension of .xlsm for macro, and then it will tell other computers that, hey, this workbook has a macro, and it will actually allow me to save it, and it will allow the other computer to run it if the user clicks Enable Content. In this lesson, you learned what macros are and why we need them, how they apply to Excel. You learned about the different file formats and which ones are supported by macros and which ones do not support macros. You learned how to use the macro recorder and also learned about how it adds extra code, so we don't necessarily want to use the macro recorder for our final macro, but to use it just to get an idea of what we should be putting in our macros. You learned how to configure Excel to run the macros, and also how to set up macro security for network locations.